All right, guys, here we are doing a quick review of the Egyptian river valley civilization. The Greek historian Herodotus calls Egypt the gift of the Nile. The Egyptian civilization existed solely because the Nile River flooded every year and brought life to Egypt. The Egyptian civilization was able to survive for so many years because it was protected by deserts in the Mediterranean Sea. And while this allows the kingdom and empire of Egypt to grow and be creative, it also isolates them from cultural diffusion, which causes problems later on in Egyptian history. Egypt was divided into two regions, Upper Egypt in the north and Lower Egypt in the south, because of the flow of the Nile River, which dumped off silt on either side of the Nile, but everybody had to live really close, and down here in the Nile Delta is where the civilization is going to take off. When it wasn't flooding, the heat of the desert could drain the Nile till it looks like that, and kind of swampy, kind of nasty, smelly, low-lying water. The other reason why Egypt was cut off from each other is because it was separated by 6 large waterfalls known as cataracts. So the people of Upper and Lower Egypt who spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, ate the same foods, had no contact. Until 3100 BC, when King Menes of Egypt was able to build relay stations around the cataracts, uniting the Egyptian empire and forming a highway along the Nile that they could use for trade and or travel. It is at this point that Egypt is divided into 3 different kingdoms: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. The dates between the kingdoms don't match up because of obstacles to overcome. Internal civil war, external invasion, irregular flood, maybe famine. There were things the Egyptian people had to simply overcome. The Old Kingdom is the iconic period of ancient Egypt. It is at this time that pharaohs ruled the land, and pharaohs were actually viewed as living gods. They had complete and total absolute power and actually owned everything inside of Egypt. There was no personal property. In time, they began to rely on a vizier or a chief of staff who could assist them in getting their tools and tasks done. During the Old Kingdom, this is the iconic period of Egypt, the period that people remember and recognize. It's when the pyramids were built on the Giza Plain. They were built as tombs to the pharaohs, and they were built by all Egyptian labor who worked 6 months a year. Egypt was divided its calendar into 3 seasons: flooding, planting, and harvesting. In the middle, in the planting season, after the crops were planted, people worked on the pyramids. It took 60 years for them to build. Contrary to popular belief, the Hebrew slaves did not build the pyramids. All this was done by pure human labor, and the key thing to know about the pyramids is that they require strong central organization. They require the group to be highly organized and a knowledge of complex mathematics to build something that precise. The ancient Egyptians worshipped the gods of nature like everyone else. They were polytheistic. Amun-Ra was the chief god, and it was Ra who was the pharaoh. It was a living representation of the god of the sun on earth. Other important gods were Osiris and Isis. Osiris is the god of the underworld and the Nile, and Isis is the goddess of the Nile and fertility. In the afterlife, the Egyptians believed the soul would go down And in a canopic jar, it would place its heart on a scale in front of Osiris. If you were a good person and the scale was balanced, then you got to enter the Egyptian afterlife, the happy valley of food. After busting your tail and working in the hot, nasty desert of Egypt for years, what better afterlife could there be than a beautiful green paradise with plentiful food and cold water? If you were a bad person and your heart was heavier than the scale, then you were eaten by a fiery crocodile, cheetah, hippopotamus creature. So early on we see that dualistic heaven and hell mentality. As a result of their burial, the Egyptians mummified the bodies to preserve them for the afterlife, and as a result, the Egyptians will become highly medically advanced, which we'll talk about here shortly. The hierarchy in Egypt is a little different than in other places. You have the pharaoh on top naturally. Then there is the vizier. Beneath that is the nobles and the high priests. And then here we have scribes and soldiers. Normally they are a level down, but in Egypt they're a little different. In fourth place are the craftsmen and artisans. Then below that are farmers and slaves. It was, however, possible in the Egyptian civilization to raise your social status by learning a new skill or through marriage, like learning how to write and working for a noble or a priest. You could move high up the social ladder. So Egyptian society was open, something we won't see for thousands of years. And women were allowed to inherit property, they could speak in court, they could even get a divorce and own their own business. So women in the ancient world had a lot of rights and responsibilities in ancient Egypt. Egyptian writing is known as hieroglyphics. It is words or symbols that when you match them together form an idea like bee and leaf that we were discussing yesterday. Early on, they were written on stone or obelisks. The Egyptians later on began to take a reed that grew in the Nile, flatten it out and dry it, and it became the world's first paper known as papyrus. And now information is being recorded, and it makes it much easier for us to remember and learn about the ancient civilizations. Mummification, once again, allows the Egyptians to understand the body. With it, they were able to observe symptoms of illnesses. They knew what medicines to prescribe. They were able to set and fix broken bones and even do advanced like spinal cord surgery. By studying the movements of the planets and stars in the desert, they developed their calendar that has 12 months and 30 days on it. And at the end, there were 5 days left over where they had a long time New Year. So a calendar very similar to ours. In the Middle Kingdom, it spells doom as conquerors from the Middle East come in, known as Hyksos. And these Hyksos are invaders who've learned how to attach the wheel that they got from China to an axle. So they have chariots pulled by horses and iron weapons, where the strongest metal the Egyptians had was copper. So the Hyksos defeat the Egyptians, and then since the Egyptians are more highly advanced, the Hyksos are absorbed into Egyptian society. And the Egyptians say, hey, why don't you show us how to ride those chariots and make those iron weapons? Combined, our armies will be unbeatable. And then the Egyptians turn the technology against the Hyksos and drive them back into the Middle East, where it kickstarts what we know as the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is known as the Age of Conquest because they go into the Middle East, forming a buffer zone between themselves and the people who attack them. There are several big-time pharaohs in the New Kingdom. We're going to talk about just a few. Number one is Queen Hatshepsut. She is the first powerful woman in history who reigns for 22 years and arranges the world's first peace treaty. So Hatshepsut, a powerful woman of influence in the ancient world. Her son Thutmose had to wait a long time to get on the throne because mom was so good that people wanted her to stay. So he is sent to military school. So Thutmose becomes a great conqueror, and he will conquer all the way to the Euphrates River, the far eastern river in the Middle East. So he is a military guy who expands the empire to its largest size. He is followed by Prince Amenhotep. How do we remember him? Can I get in? Amenhotep. Yes, exactly. And Amenhotep was a religious pharaoh who closed all of the other temples to the gods and goddesses except those worshiping Amun-Ra, or what he thought was himself. This upsets the other Egyptians because they were afraid the deities would get angry at them, so he does not last very long on the throne. He is followed by the famous boy king, King Tut. And King Tut is special. He was a minor pharaoh, but in 1922, Howard Carter found his tomb. It is the only pharaoh's tomb found ever completely and totally intact. And as a result, we know a lot more about the New Kingdom from the artifacts we found in King Tut's tomb. Last but not least is King Ramses II. He is famous for appearing in the book of Exodus in the Bible. This is Moses, the son of the Pharaoh who shared time with the adopted brother Moses. So he has the 10 plagues of Egypt Pharaoh. He does free the Hebrew slaves, that is him. But as an Egyptian, you would have thought Ramses was a good pharaoh. He reigns for an incredible 67 years, and he will make a peace treaty with the people in the Middle East to help build on trade after reconquering much of it. And so he kind of sets the Egyptian civilization up to carry on. Unfortunately, while he did father 150 children, he does not train a successor. And while he had Egypt on the track to success, it quickly falls apart after his death. The Egyptians were highly advanced. They accumulated a lot of knowledge, not only in medicine, but in mathematics, surveying, geometry. They used the trial and error method to make sure things were flowing trial and error method. When something didn't work, they wrote it down, and they went back and tried to fix it. So they wrote down the stuff that worked to help the civilization keep flowing well. As we talked about, they mapped the constellation and the stars, and they were able to perform these complex surgeries. Even fixing broken teeth or embedding cadaver teeth and rotting gums, and making prosthetics for different body parts that were hurt in the backbreaking, grueling labor, digging the irrigation canals, planting the foods, farm labor, even building the pyramids took its toll on ancient Egypt. When it comes to writing, we could not read a lot of Egyptian writing for many years. And then after Napoleon conquered Egypt, his men will find the Rosetta Stone in a quarry while they were mining for copper. It has 3 types of writing on it: Egyptian hieroglyphic, Egyptian shorthand known as Demotic, and at the bottom it was Greek. After the New Kingdom collapses, the world lost the ability to read hieroglyphics until Jean Champollion, a linguist at Sorbonne, the University of Paris, will spend 22 years translating the hieroglyphics into Greek, and in the Greek into French, English, and Spanish. So it took him almost his entire career. So we have only been able to to read hieroglyphics for about 190, 192, 93 years. So there is a lot more to learn about the wonderful Egyptian civilization. That is a quick AP wrap-up. Shortly after this will come Mesopotamia, India, and China, and I'll see you guys shortly. Have a good night.